All right, I guess we can start.
Okay,
You can,
okay, good.
I guess you can just introduce yourself.
Okay, well, I'm Lanier Clance.
Oh, it's nice to meet you.
Okay, same here.
I guess we can just talk about maybe the beginning of, talk about when you first decided you want to become a minister. We can start there.
Well, I mean, I came out of a conservative religious background, so, and a community where I've always liked the spoken word, and ministers could change people, you know, that I like that, speaking. And so, I was real young. I was in probably elementary school or something.
Yeah.
And I didn't act on it then like child preachers or something, but I would imagine myself preaching out into the moon. I'd just make up sermons and stuff like that. And then my philosophy kept getting more progressive, and I really was not believing in the kind of it was Southern Baptist view of the world by the time I got to college, but I went on a partial religious scholarship and started studying philosophy and political theory in Lynchburg College, Lynchburg, Virginia. And it was a church-related, but with the Disciples of Christ, which were a very mainstream, kind of like congregational. They were, you call them a left-wing Protestant group, because they had congregational polity. The congregation called the minister. The congregation owned the building. The congregation decided when to sell, when to build. So all the power, it was a very democratic, radical democratic structure. And they were fairly, in regard in 1957, when I went to college, they would have been a moderate, progressive religious group. This was before all the fundamentalism invaded major Protestant denominations, but they were so the college wasn't run like there was a chaplain and they had religious programs, but people were there going into all kind of things, and they had people that weren't Christians. They had humanists and atheists and other people on campus. And I started preaching in '59. I went out to rural and small town churches in Virginia. This was out in Lunenburg County near Richmond, but it was in the tobacco cotton fields. Tobacco was the big money crop. And I went in '59 and tried out, and they'd have 2 or 3 ministers come down from the college. And I was mid-time in my junior year, and December, and I went and I preached 3 times, and then he had somebody else, and they call it calling or settled. They called me there into December. And then I took another one that was about 10 miles or 15 miles away. It used to be in rural Virginia, every 7 miles there would be a church. And it happened to be Disciples of Christ were the big ones in that area. It might be a Baptist church, a Methodist church, a buggy ride. About 3.5 miles would be a buggy ride to church.
Mostly, very rural, I take it.
Yeah, this was rural. Our teeny little towns that I was in, little towns later along the Ohio River, like 100 people or something like that. But this was really rural. It was out and I started preaching there in '59. And by that time, I was already, my concept of Christian theology that was very, I believed in the power of love. And in the book of James in the New Testament, it's an ethics book that Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation person, said it should be thrown out because all it had to do with the book was a book of straw. It had things like, how can you love God if you don't love your neighbor? and real practical kind of Buddhist type say. It's all on ethics and about gossiping about people and all that stuff. And I'd preach mostly that, and I didn't believe in hell at that point. And there are Christian groups throughout history that didn't believe in hell and stuff. And so I never preached about that. And and it was very political. And the radical thing I did then was I campaigned for John F. Kennedy and had bumper sticker on my car and had them in the back. And there was a lot of anti-Catholic stuff going on about Kennedy that never got into urban areas, but throughout the rural areas of the Midwest and the South, especially in the South, about him being under control of the Pope. And I mean, just ridiculous
so people were
stuff.
saying that since he was Catholic,
Yeah.
the Pope was going to control his decisions.
And the Catholic, the whole Protestant Catholic stuff was played on, and lots of literature was mailed out. It's surprising. Even these were traditional Democratic areas. And Virginia generally has gone Republican since the time I was there, certainly. So he lost, but it was a close margin. And then I finished college, and I had, my major was philosophy and my minor was political theory. And by then I was already a pretty clear humanist, that I mean, this stuff, it just didn't make any sense to me. But I also had this childhood connection. As a little kid, you're kind of brainwashed, and it's all in your cells and everything, that I wanted to know what Christianity was about, because people would say if you rejected it, you didn't really understand it. That's what I got when I tell people, many people around the seminary. But my philosophy professor was quite radical, and my political theorist was a humanist.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't like it was a religious environment. I mean, it's a very ethical-oriented environment. And I then went to Kentucky, the seminary, because I really thought, well, I'm going to understand Christianity. When I say no, nobody, I've studied 4 years. I majored in historical theology. That's the very earliest parts of Christianity. And I took quite some Bible, and I know what it says, and I've studied it. And I majored in pastoral counseling. I minored in pastoral counseling, but I majored in historical theology. So for 3 years, I stayed 4 years it took me. I studied all the church fathers, Augustine, Origen, all these people that were like the second and third generation after Jesus was supposedly around. And the more I read that stuff, I knew I didn't believe it. So the dean was he was the theological professor, and he let me write my thesis on the concept of God in John Dewey, the educator, and Henry Nelson Wyman. And Henry Nelson Wyman was a Christian who had become a Unitarian, and his concept of God was that God is creative process. And Dewey's concept was God is the process of actualizing the ideal. So both of these were very humanistic people.
Yeah.
And I did my fortunately my thesis was in that. I was serving Christian churches along the Ohio River, one in Gent, Kentucky, and the last one I served in California, Kentucky, little former riverboat towns, and now we're teeny towns. One was outside of Louisville, and the other was outside of Cincinnati, a few miles up the river.
So you were preaching Christian sermons?
Yeah, well, I was doing 2 kind of sermons, and that's when I decided to join Unitarians, or make application to them. I realized I was preaching one where I'd take all the Bible, because you can do anything you want to. I mean, you know, it's however you interpret. And then I'd have a parallel thing where I would use more contemporary psychology and philosophy and political science. And if you listen closely to Martin Luther King Jr.'s sermons, he has a parallel because he speaks to the people, and then he's got an intellectual thread running through there. That's real interesting. And I later, I was doing it and became aware of it, and then I started, and he kind of helped give me that model where you could speak to the people, and you could also speak to the people who were quite intellectual and beginning to question. And you kind of use both, and you just run them along parallel. I think I may have it somewhere. I may have an old sermons up there on some old big disc or something that I preached at that time. And by the time I got through seminary, I knew I wasn't a Christian, and didn't believe in heaven. I don't believe in hell. I don't believe in absolutes. And by that time also what I encountered there, and this affected my intellectual development, is I got very connected with the psychology department, which was influenced, in Lex, Kentucky, of all places, the VA hospital was a center for phenomenological psychology and philosophy, which is related to existentialism. And basically it talks about perceptions and all this of what you perceive, and you don't get into truth, you just bracket what somebody's running around saying the earth's falling. You say, okay, they're saying the earth's falling. What does that mean to you? How does that affect your behavior? And they put out 2 books. And here in this little town was this radical, and there's the University of Kentucky and some small church-related colleges, and the seminary was connected to the Disciples of Christ. And I had a very fortunate position because they always liked to have one kind of village atheist around to prove they weren't training, that they were educating. And the professors enjoyed me being in class because I'd make my remarks. So it really was a tremendously intellectual, stimulating environment in the seminary for me, because being a minority meant I had to really think through. Like, I'd say I didn't believe in heaven and hell and all this afterlife stuff. And some of my colleagues say, well, then what keeps you from committing suicide? And I'd say, well, that never occurred to me. I mean, I like lobster. There's a lot, you know, that just isn't there. Believing in that, because I don't believe in that, don't have anything. But I'd be asked questions, so I had to, it forced me to think, and plus then, to get back to this, a number of the psychologists were strongly influenced by existentialism, was becoming popular, and humanistic psychology is becoming popular, and Carl Rogers, the concept of non-directive therapy, counseling. Yeah, this was from 60 to 65. And the whole humanistic psychology movement and the whole thing about it being an elite Freudian thing that very rich people got, and poor people got shock treatment and what few drugs there were. But it was opening up the whole concept of subjective, in-depth psychotherapy rather than just counseling. And that was tremendously exciting to me because I was existential by then. I'd studied independently Sartre and Nietzsche and Camus, all the French, Ponty, Simone de Beauvoir, were the people who influenced me the most. And the one sermon I preached there, I began with Nietzsche's quote that God is dead. About this time, the God is dead theology come. Pardon me, it became popular. The Protestant theologians were writing about it. It was a time things were intellectually a lot looser, so I found it real stimulating. I had good relationships in the seminary, and I had to work my way. I drove a school bus for 2 years, and I worked in dry cleaning and worked in the library, and I preached on weekends. So by the time I got out of seminary, I'd been preaching 6 years and living with people, so it prepared me for some of my eventual work with family systems, because I got intimately connected with a lot of family systems. When you stay in people's homes, to stay up late or to get a glass of iced tea at night, or get up early or whatever, you have to learn how the systems are to get what you need. And some I never did. One home I stayed with, a woman liked to serve fried eggs. And I liked them dumb, and I ate fried eggs every time I stayed there, raw as hell. I never did get across to her when my eggs were well done, but you just learned, whatever you got to deal with there. And I applied to the Unitarians for fellowship. And there was a Unitarian group in town that was rather humanistic, a fellowship. And the Unitarians, since probably in the mid-1800s, have had a strong humanistic side and a strong theistic Christian side. They've had a non-Christian side and the humanist, which were not particularly Christian. And the group I was more connected with was humanistic, and I assumed they were more humanistic, not so Christian, with my experience. And then I had met, my early experiences with therapy was first a social worker named Cotton, and then Arturo Wingfield, who was a psychiatrist, existential psychiatrist, and he was paid for by the Ford Foundation, and you got 15 minutes once a week, and he didn't give out the name to keep it confidential, so you put a little X up there, and as soon as the sign was posted, all our friends would run up there and put some little thing, and you knew it was your time. And that was and I saw him a little after I got out of it, because I was torn between this Christianity stuff and being a minister and not being Christian anymore. That's a conflict I felt torn with. And I was also very torn with the whole civil rights movement was beginning. And in Virginia, I did not demonstrate when the kids went down. Some of the kids from the college and 2 other women's colleges went down and demonstrated in Virginia. I went to a lunchroom and all sat down together. And then we had meetings on college whether we should put them out of school, and people went and talked about it. It was a big deal. That was about the time I was almost leaving my senior year. And in my churches, I was torn emotionally whether I came out as strong. I kept talking about people being brothers and related, as explicit as I could get. Once I talked about Jesus was more like if he had been black or a Negro. And a lot of rednecks then, I thought they were going to fire me, because I kept thinking I'd get fired and that'd be heroic. And afterwards, I knew why they said rednecks, because a lot of those guys were just as red, mad, and I thought, okay, they'll fire me. And at this time, that had been kind of a romantic ideal, because I could have found something else. My parents were paying for my college, but I was paying to support a car, which I broke even on, because I made $35 a week, but gas was 31 cents a gallon, so you got to think about. But they didn't fire me. 2 weeks later, I served these congregations. I'd go every 2 weeks and alternate. And when I went back 2 weeks later, I guess they decided they wouldn't fire me. So I did decide when I went to the next congregations, I'd put explicitly when I was talking to them exactly where I stood on the racial situation. But Kentucky's a border state, and they're real weird as a border state. So when I went to seminary and I went out looking at congregations, I said straight out where I stood on racial issues. and they all hired me. One of them, I had a deaf organist who had used to play in Chautauqua places,
So,
and he'd play the organ so while the pulpit, and he didn't like it, and he'd say every time I started preaching race, he'd say out loud as he could, "Oh, that, not that again." I mean, it's,
and he was